Okay, so I would like to start today's presentation with a reflection on what degrowth is not. So degrowth is not a call for recession. It's not a new austerity paradigm. It's not a new development program imposed from the imperial core to its peripheries. Much rather, I would say, degrowth is a critique to capitalist society's current approach to achieving prosperity and sustainability, and it's also the proposal for an alternative. But what is actually capitalist society's current approach to achieving prosperity and sustainability? That would be the paradigm of green growth. Green growth postulates, I would say, two things. First, it argues that society needs continued economic growth for us all to flourish. And then second, it argues that economic growth can go hand in hand with environmental sustainability. Now, degrowth, as I just said, contests those two credos. Degrowth argues first that growth is in fact not equivalent to prosperity. And to make that claim, it draws on empirical research that shows how the material wealth that growth creates is unequally distributed, both globally, but also within nations. So to give you just two examples here, the richest 10% of the world population own 76% of the global wealth. Meanwhile, the bottom 50% own only 2%. And even in high-income nations with high GDPs, there's immense inequality. In the Netherlands, for example, the richest 10% own 60% of the collective wealth. Interestingly, those figures also correlate with carbon footprints. So, for example, the richest 10% of the world are responsible for 50% of all carbon emissions. In Europe and North America, the richest 10% emit roughly 5 times more per capita than the bottom 50%. This tells us something about what Matthew Huber has also called climate change as class war. Now, Huber, by the way, is not a fan of degrowth, but I will get to that later. Before to do so, I should make a second point about growth and prosperity, and that's a point about quality. So as most of us might know, the figure through which we measure economic growth, the gross domestic product or GDP, is a figure that measures the monetary value of all goods and services that an economy produces in a specific time frame. As such, it does not tell us anything about the quality of the goods and services that this economy produces and how these are aligned with our needs. So, for example, producing munitions for war registers positively in our GDP. And yet, are nations that produce tons of war munitions really doing well? Because that is what GDP is nowadays taken to measure, our collective well-being. Meanwhile, when I cook a meal for my family or plant trees in a local park, then I'm creating value, but that value does not register as GDP because it is not being sold. If, in contrast, I order us a pizza or invest in a carbon offsetting scheme that plants trees in a faraway forest, possibly by robbing local communities of their land, then this would register positively as GDP. Now, my point here is not necessarily that producing defense is bad or that carbon offsetting schemes are always evil. Rather, my point is that when it comes to measuring our collective well-being, GDP is a flawed instrument. And historical research also shows us that this is not how GDP was intended. Yet in public discourse, it is how it is being framed. Politicians on left and right want but one thing, which is to deliver us high GDP figures, no matter how, and no matter for whom. Okay, so all of that to explain why degrowth contests the first green growth belief, namely that growth is good. But what about the second green growth belief, namely that economic growth and environmental sustainability can go together? A key term to introduce here is the term decoupling. So what the green growth ideology postulates is that economic growth can be decoupled from its negative environmental impacts, such as resource use, pollution, and of course, emissions. Now you might ask, how? And of course, the answer is through technology. We might see how that is, in a way, an attractive idea. First, we do know that technology can help in in reducing ecological harm. After all, that's what renewable energy does, or recycling. Second, decoupling promises that in societies where resource use and pollution are high, such as high-income countries, we don't need to touch our levels of consumption. The idea of green growth is that each year we can produce and consume more, generating growth, while at the same time resource use and emissions will go down. So that would be the green line here in this figure. Now, the crucial question is, of course, is that possible? And the answer here is yes, at least when it comes to emissions. So there is reason to believe that renewable energy could allow us to keep growing our GDPs, while at the same time lowering our emissions. But actually, we are asking the wrong question, because the question should not be if decoupling is theoretically possible. The question should be, is this decoupling possible at the speed and scale that is needed to avert an ecological breakdown? And here studies show us, again and again, how this is highly unlikely, even when we assume optimistic policy conditions. There's no empirical evidence supporting the existence of a decoupling of economic growth from environmental pressures on anywhere near the scale needed to deal with environmental breakdown, but also, and perhaps more importantly, such decoupling appears unlikely to happen in the future. That's the conclusion of a recent report that was commissioned by the European Environmental Bureau. Now, I won't waste too much time on the details, but I'd like to highlight two reasons why decoupling is so difficult. The first is rebound effects. We know that gains in ecological efficiency, such as less resource use through recycling or less emissions through green energy, are often offset by increases in demand. It's a bit like trying to run down an upward escalator. The second reason is problem shifting, which means that the solutions that we find to one ecological problem might exacerbate another ecological problem. So, for example, electric vehicles might help us with reducing our carbon emissions, yes, yet replacing all our cars with electric vehicles would also lead to immense waste. All those cars would get thrown away, and it would require immense levels of raw material extraction, such as lithium for car batteries. Some of those raw materials are currently extracted under horrible conditions for workers, including children. And what I haven't yet even mentioned is that economic growth in high-income nations of the global north currently also relies on an immense level of resource and labor exploitation in the global south. In 2015 alone, the global north net appropriated 12 billion tons of raw materials, 822 million hectares of land, 21 exajoules of energy, and 188 million person-years of labor from the global south. So the value of all this could eliminate extreme poverty 70 times over. In a way, then, we are kind of closing a loop here. I've started my talk by arguing how economic growth is unequally distributed, and I'm now showing why that is. Because growth under capitalist conditions is never just a project of creating collective wealth, even though that's how it's being advertised. It's rather a project of creating wealth for an elite by means of exploitation. To create surplus in a capitalist economy, someone, human or more than human, must give without receiving a proper compensation. If that was not the case, then there would be no capitalist accumulation, no shareholder profit, so to speak. But I'm getting carried away, because I also want to say a few words about what degrowth proposes as an alternative. Again, it would be extremely hard to unpack all this in 10 minutes. Entire books have been written on degrowth, and I recommend reading at least one of them. By now, degrowth is also not just an abstract pipe dream without concrete policy suggestions. You could have said so 10 years ago, maybe, but not any longer. Degrowth advocates have a whole packages of policy suggestions, and again, I won't manage to present them all today. Instead, what I'd like to do is present 5 principles of which I think that they are important. And the first will be to aim for well-being rather than GDP growth. So the suggestion here, in a way, is rather simple. Rather than equating societal well-being with GDP, societies should ditch the idea of economic growth and pursue well-being directly. So what actually makes us well? I would say intact ecosystems make us well, and they are a precondition to everything else. And they're currently not valued in GDP because what they provide in terms of clean air, fresh water, pollination, nutritious soil, and all that comes for free. Meanwhile, healthcare, education, food, shelter, and a political system that is democratic, allowing us to pursue just forms of social interaction and economic exchange, would probably also score high on a well-being wish list. Again, here we can see the limits of GDP in accounting for such well-being factors. From the point of view of GDP, we can destroy the foundations of all life on this planet. As long as we keep producing stuff that can be sold on the market, no problem. From the point of view of GDP, we can produce massive amounts of commercial office space and tons of weight loss pills, while at the same time failing to provide people with housing and decent health care. GDP just doesn't register this. That this is a problem. As long as the figure grows, we're all just doing fine. That's why my second degrowth demand, linked to the first, would be to value that which brings value and not just that which is sold. It is in this respect that the demand for degrowth also fundamentally relates to feminist demands for better recognition and compensation for the labor of social reproduction and care. But how to do that? If we want to value that which brings value, for instance, through care wages, then the third principle, which is crucial to the degrowth proposal, must be met, and that is redistribute. Now, redistribute from the rich to the rest, and the instruments to achieve this include policies like taxes on profit, inheritance, and financial transactions, taxes on capital gains and acquisition, and taxes on luxury consumption, among others. This would need to be combined with a global crackdown on tax dodging and tax havens and an elimination of all subsidies for ecologically harmful industries. To give you just one example here, 7.1% of the global GDP, so $7 trillion, 12 zeros, are currently invested in fossil fuel subsidies. Imagine what could be financed from that money. At the moment, however, it is put into industries that destroy the basis of our livelihoods, while at the same time creating profits for shareholders. Currently, the richest 1% own more than the poorest 95% of the world population combined. So it's definitely time to redistribute. But we also need redistribution for another reason. We've established before how the ideal of decoupling economic growth from ecological harm is flawed. It's not possible at the speed and scale required, and it shifts problems around rather than solving them. What this implies is that in societies whose levels of production and consumption are incompatible with ecological targets, so in particular in high-income nations, we need more than just green technology. We also need reduction. And the degrowth terminology for this is combining efficiency with sufficiency. So degrowthers would say, yes, let's electrify our cars, fine, but let's also make sure that we drive less and that we build and use more public transport. Or yes, let's recycle, but let's also try to create and buy less unnecessary gadgets, as well as make sure that the gadgets that we do need last longer. Such a shift, however, is likely to lead to a shrinking of certain ecologically harmful industries, such as cars and fossil fuels, aviation, the meat and dairy industries, plastic and packaging, information and communication technologies, fast fashion, and so on. It's here where the degrowth story starts to get controversial, because it implies a loss in certain jobs, not all jobs, and state revenues. And that's the second reason why we need redistribution. While certain industries shrink, we need to ensure that everyone in society has access to a basic income, and 2, basic services, such as housing, education, and healthcare. The instruments to achieve this are called universal basic income and universal basic services. And the way to finance them is through redistribution. Now, a fourth degrowth principle would be to support and upscale practices of commoning. Commoning happens whenever communities get together to co-produce and also democratically co-manage the resources that they need, whether that's material resources such as food or immaterial resources such as care. So, for example, an energy cooperative that co-produces and co-manages common energy provision would be commons. Users of Wikipedia also co-produce shared knowledge and thus are engaged in commoning. The key about commoning is that it relies on democratic principles of self-organization and that it decouples the provision of these goods and services from capitalist growth imperatives. So, for example, a food cooperative does not need to create shareholder profit in order for it to survive. It suffices for it to fulfill the needs of its members. And then finally, there is a fifth degrowth principle, which is possibly the least popular, and that would be to institute caps on resource use. This principle is above all else about effectiveness. As it stands under green growth conditions, what we do is we try to make production more efficient and consumption more efficient, and then we hope that this will eventually lead to a drop in resource use and emissions. Now, degrowthers would say the time for such half-hearted measures that at best approximate critical ecological targets really has run out. We cannot afford to try any longer. Reduce resource use and emissions we must. So that's why degrowthers would say we need fixed budgets for non-renewable resources, such as coal, gas, and oil, but also things such as primary forests, which is currently re-eroded at a big scale, mostly to produce livestock feed, so food for animals that then become human food. These budgets, and that's important, must be matched with justice criteria. So, for example, countries that have so far appropriated a disproportionate amount of global resources should get a low budget, and countries that have not should get a higher budget. This then also relates to a misunderstanding often associated with degrowth, namely that degrowth proponents deny countries in the global south the right to increase their living standards. The opposite is actually the case. Degrowth argues that in order for low-income countries to be able to increase their living standards and in order for them not to be subjected to climate catastrophe, rich countries must stop appropriating their labor and resources with the goal to fuel their own domestic growth. Or to put it in the words of Jason Hinkle, in terms of both emissions and resource use, excess consumption in the North relies on patterns of colonization, the appropriation of the South's fair share of atmospheric commons, and the plunder of southern ecosystems. From this perspective, degrowth in the North represents a process of decolonization in the South, to the extent that it releases communities in the South from the pressures of atmospheric colonization and material extractivism. What this means, however, is that within rich countries, we must institute policies for reduction. We cannot keep appropriating global rare earth metals, primary forests, atmospheric commons, etc. For this to happen, certain forms of consumption, such as car driving, flying, meat eating, dairy consumption, fast fashion, techno gadgets, etc., must go down. Now, as you can imagine, this is one of the reasons why, to date, degrowth is not all that popular. And that's the case on right and left. So the Marxist geographer Matthew Huber, for example, the one I mentioned earlier, who wrote Climate Change as Class War, he has described degrowth as a politics of less, unattractive for the working classes, unlikely to gather mass appeal. And he has published various articles about that in Jacobin magazine. Amana Fontanella Khan, the Guardian US opinion editor recently described, or rather accused, the degrowth movement of techno-pessimism. Degrowth is often accused of lacking a positive vision, even if I would not agree. And the Guardian columnist Larry Elliott recently argued that degrowth has an image problem. Elliott, however, acknowledges that degrowth is an important proposal. For him, degrowth urgently needs to solve its image problem for it to gain political traction. It is here, I believe, that cultural studies can help a bit. But what is cultural studies? Some of you here may have a background in cultural studies, but I'm still going to briefly define it. Cultural studies is a branch of social science and humanities research that is particularly interested in popular mass culture and questions regarding the interrelation between culture and politics. As Marjorie Ferguson and Peter Golding also put it, cultural studies insists that culture must be investigated within the social relations and system in which it is produced and consumed, and that analysis of culture is thus intimately bound up with the study of society, politics, and economics. In the British tradition, which is the one I follow, cultural studies is often taught together with media studies, and it's mostly taught as a social science rather than in the humanities departments. But why is that useful for degrowth? As you can imagine, degrowth researchers have already shown interest in questions of cultural politics. Degrowth is, after all, a normative project. It wants something to happen for the future, and it wants to know how to make this culturally accepted and politically viable. And there is urgency to this project. We cannot wait another 30 years because we're in a climate crisis, there are climate tipping points, because we're in the midst of the sixth mass extinction, because people and planet are suffering already every day from capitalist exploitation and extractivism facilitated via imperial oppression. At the same time, however, I'd argue that most degrowth research has so far limited its perspectives on culture and cultural practice to cultural practice as a means to prefigure degrowth futures. The concept of prefiguration in this context stems from anarchist thought and means something like enacting a desired future in the present or enacting activist goals within activist means. So be the change you want to see in society. To do so, degrowth researchers tend to make a point of taking inspiration from ideas, designs, and practices that are local and grassroots, feminist and queer, that derive from indigenous communities and or originate from the global south. Case studies have so far included things such as eco-villages, community currencies, the philosophies of Ubuntu and Buen Vivir, etc., etc. The point here is to decolonize post or degrowth practices away from Western universalism and to emphasize plurality. Of course, nothing whatsoever is wrong with this approach, but I do think that we can add another branch of cultural research to this. What this branch of research would need to do is focus on social settings and cultural practices that currently seem far away from degrowth, to see how that could be changed. By the way, I'm not the first to point this out. The cultural economy scholar Mark Banks has also argued that degrowth has yet to produce an analysis of how any new values might be empirically grounded or lived, that is, encouraged to take root or prevented from doing so in any specific or named social, geographical, and cultural milieu. And what he means here is, in particular, are the cultural milieus where the hegemony of capitalist growth prevails. Specifically, I see three fields where cultural studies could intervene. The first would be the cultural industries. As it stands, culture is not just a localized community practice. It's also a global industry with organized systems of production, distribution, and consumption. Those systems of production, distribution, and consumption are for most part governed by capitalist logics. So a first question that degrowth research must ask is how to change that. There's research already on cultural cooperatives as a means for decoupling cultural production from capitalist markets. That's promising, but I think we need much more. In addition, I believe that it needs more research on how to popularize degrowth ideology by the cultural industries. Now, some might say that this is propaganda, but then again, what are we pretending? Degrowth is not just a scientific analysis. It's a political project that is based on scientific analysis. And as such, it needs a strategy of mass mobilization. And for that, it needs the cultural industries. What I'm saying, I think, resonates most with the branch of cultural studies that is interested in questions of media and hegemony. What kind of media power will it need to solve degrowth's image problem? What media organizations will it need? How can existing media organizations be co-opted? How can degrowth ideas be leaked into the mainstream media landscape? To put it in the words of Nick Strishnik and Alec Williams, media organizations are an essential part of any emergent political ecology aimed at building a new hegemony. The tasks involved in such a strategy demand a healthy media presence, creating a new common language, giving voice to people, naming the antagonism, raising expectations, generating narratives that will resonate with people, and articulating in clear language the grievances we feel. This then also relates to my second suggestion, namely, we need more degrowth research on popular cultures and desires with the aim to politicize them for degrowth. My own work on minimalist self-help falls a bit into that realm. Throughout the past 6 years, I have researched minimalist self-help in contemporary lifestyle literature, TV shows, and online communities. Now, please don't get me wrong. I don't think that minimalism is degrowth. Minimalism is a commodified lifestyle trend. It's highly individualist. It's imbued with neoliberal ideology, and it often relies on privilege. So my point was never to use minimalism as an inspiration for degrowth futures. Rather, I'm researching minimalism to learn about the problems and desires that preoccupy precisely those classes that, according to current wisdom, are opposed to a degrowth transition, the middle classes of affluent societies. What I learned is that these classes, the globally affluent, which are not the same as the global capitalist class, also entertain desires that could well be combined with a degrowth agenda. They feel overwhelmed, stressed, and distracted. They find it meaningless to pursue a lifestyle of endless consumerist accumulation. They long for resonance with the material world, for free idleness. And they crave liberation from a system that constantly nudges them into maximizing their levels of productivity, consumption, and attention to media. At the moment, however, most of those cravings are subsumed by neoliberal self-help culture. How can it be politicized and connected to the degrowth movement? My research makes some suggestions here, but then again, minimalism is only one popular culture that degrowth might wish to politicize. And affluent middle classes are but one target group, so it needs a way more research on popular culture and popular desires. In particular, I think that it needs research with an affect theory angle, which examines structures of feeling that are widespread in capitalist societies, which could be connected to degrowth politics. And finally, I think it also needs more research on social movement cultures and art activism for degrowth. So as it stands, there are a range of social movements sympathetic with degrowth, in particular in the field of climate justice and anti-extractivism. Often those movements use cultural practice as a tool for mobilization, as an instrument for movement internal community building, and as a tactic for activism. So for example, Extinction Rebellion has this ethics of regenerative culture, which is all about practicing care, self-care, people care, planet care. Meanwhile, there's a huge arsenal of cultural tactics for political activism that degrowth could explore further. An overview of some of those tactics is given on the website Beautiful Trouble, Creative Tools for a More Just World. What we're lacking, however, is research on the employment of those cultural tactics. What tactics work and in what context do they work? How can creative tactics be integrated into a wider political strategy? And perhaps most importantly, what culture of organizing do we need? Can degrowth rely on pluriversal and horizontalist organizing alone, as it is currently favored, I would say, in the degrowth literature, to achieve its goals? Or is a more centralized and hierarchical form of organizing needed, as currently suggested by initiatives such as, for instance, Climate Vanguard? Now, arguably, some of those questions I asked now stretch beyond the sphere of cultural studies, and that's fine. Degrowth tends to define itself as a post-normal science, which means that it's interdisciplinary, oriented towards problem solving and collaborating with societal partners. I think that cultural studies can play a role in this, and I'd love to hear your ideas on what else this might entail. Thanks for your patience.
Thank you a lot for your presentation, for this wonderful and rich presentation, and full also of fundamental problems. And now is the moment of the other speaker. And
yes, thank you again. Let me introduce you, Federica Guida. Federica has a degree in modern literature, and now she is enrolled in a PhD course entitled Research and Social Innovation at the Faculty of Political and Social Sciences at the University of Cagliari. With her research project, she is exploring the relationship between sociology and women's literature, in particular between eco-criticism, women's magazines, and romantic novels. And her research focuses on three founding constructs: the relationship between human and non-human, the ethics of care, the meanings of motherhood. In light of the increasingly widespread interest in the topic of communication and gender, with an intersectional and interdisciplinary research perspective, she is reconstructing a Bourdieusian field of female culture production between economic and symbolic capital, between market interests and neurasthenic figures such as the female one. She has published for Imago, Journal of the Social Imaginary, Lights in the Shadows, Women Writers in the Attic Between Creation and Resistance. The title of a presentation, today's presentation is Degrowth, Post-Human and Ecofeminism, Imagining a New Social Model from the World. So thank you, Federica, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'm trying to share my presentation. Okay, can you see it?
yes. Yes.
Okay. So first of all, I would like to thank Luca and Andrea for inviting me to this interesting discussion. And I would extend my greetings to Professor Baptiste, who started this fruitful and stimulating exchange. I've been thinking about the idea of degrowth and how it is related to ecofeminism literature, and I really enjoyed it. So it's been a great challenge for me and has led me to some really interesting reflections and texts. So today I'd love to share some parts with you. So there is no need to say that contemporary area is witnessing the spreading of vulnerabilities of our socioeconomic foundations, capitalism, production, labor, and efficiency. But I wonder what happens when these pillars falter, and what remains of humanity and of human when the model of infinite growth proves to be unsustainable. So the intent of this contribution is to start from the concepts proposed by Professor Meissner on degrowth and minimalism between social practices and daily ideologies. And I would like to put them in relation with the theories on the post-human of Rossi Braidotti and with the studies on capitalism and feminism proposed by Silvia Federici. So the aim is to offer a critical perspective on the intertwining of capitalism, patriarchy, and consumerism, and to question the possibility of challenging these. So starting from these contemporary philosophical feminist theories, I would propose a critical reading of the novel The Wall, written by Marlene Haushofer, which is a narrative space where contemporary contemporary economic, social, and philosophical scenarios take shape long before entering in public and academic debate. So literature here serves as a crucial tool for mediation and imagination. So aligning with the aim of this conference of highlighting emancipatory potential of ecofeminism in shaping new social paradigms. So in the cultural media landscape, there has been a proliferation of narratives that question the accumulation model. In Caliban and the Witch, Federici rethought the development of capitalism from a feminist point of view, analyzing the historical role of women in the rise of capitalism. So she proposes a reinterpretation of Marx's primitive accumulation, arguing that capitalism has not only developed through the expropriation of land and the formation of the working class, but also through the violent subjugation of women and the demonization of women's body. So the critique of capitalism is closely interconnected with the theme of exploitation of nature and resources. And recent years have seen the emergence of cultural movements that reject the accumulation of material goods and promote a more minimalistic lifestyle. So this tendency can be interpreted as a response to the prevailing trends of excessive consumption. However, the question remains, how can these emergent social paradigms be adequately articulated? So to address this inquiry, it is necessary to draw upon the insights offered by Professor Meissner. As she states, degrowth is a socially beneficial and realistically flexible response to urgent problems. In her perspective, degrowth is not only an economic necessity, but also a phenomenon that manifests in terms of everyday social practices and ideologies. So in this context, degrowth as an alternative economic proposition aims to mitigate reliance on wage labor and mass production, favoring instead more local forms of economy founded on cooperation and redistribution of resources. So minimalism must evolve into an anti-accumulative and political act if it has to have tangible impact, and it must connect to the struggle for degrowth. So minimalism is considered as an alternative lifestyle emerged as a response to overconsumption and accumulation. However, it is the risk of being constrained within a neoliberal logic if it is merely reduced to an individualistic phenomenon divorced from the systemic transformation. So I will be addressing this question in more detail at later point. So the decline of, okay, just a moment. Okay. The decline of anthropocentrism and androcentrism has created a new space for reconstruction. Rosy Braidotti, in her philosophy of the post-human, invites us to rethink the human subject, questioning neoliberalism and recognizing our interconnection with the environment and other forms of life. Her concept of post-human subject challenges the prevailing notion of isolated entity, proposing instead a paradigm of relationships and coexistence. So this perspective stands in contrast to the prevailing capitalistic logic of performativity and self-sufficiency, elements identified by Professor Meissner as contributing to the erosion of minimalism transformative potential. So Braidotti philosophies suggest that degrowth should be understood exclusively in economic or material terms, but also as an epistemological transformation. In this context, it can be interpreted as a posthumanist project, which is not limited to the reduction of consumption, but implies a reconfiguration of the relationship between humans, technology, and nature. So in order to implement such a change of social and cultural paradigms, it is necessary to start from what Braidotti defines as faith in the creative power of the imagination that feminist perspectival knowledge practices from every day. So literature is also entrusted with the task of reimagining reality and promoting new perspectives and models to a wider audience. And this is what happened to in the novel by Marlene Haushofer. She's an Austrian author who, decades ahead of the effects of the feminist movements, brought the premises of ecofeminism into a form of a novel, combining criticism to patriarchy and the need to rethink the relationship between the human and the non-human. And The Wall is a novel that portrays a woman who must redefine her relationship with the resources and the natural world, relinquishing the conventional structures of accumulation and productivity. Critics often categorize this text as either utopian or dystopian, yet it provides a genuine depiction of the environment and events, because it is interesting that in order to describe a society in which the protagonist is forced to exist outside the dynamics of capitalism and technological domination, she had to invent an apocalyptic situation. Since Marlene Haushofer is not yet well known, I would like to briefly introduce the novel and some of its key themes. So the protagonist is an unnamed woman who finds herself in an unexpected situation. One morning in a mountain house, she discovers that an invisible but impenetrable wall separates her from the rest of the world. And this barrier extends in every direction, isolating her completely. And she suspects that beyond the wall, all living beings are dead due to the global catastrophe. So she takes care of a cow, a doll, a cat, dog who became her only companions. And as time goes by, she learns to live in harmony with nature, growing her own food and facing the difficulties of loneliness, self-sufficiency. And in this isolation, the woman begins to reevaluate her past life and the meaning of human relationships. Now, I really hate to spoil the novel, but I have to because of the symbolic meaning of the end. So, during a summer, the protagonist returns to the Alps with her animals, but something terrible happens. Her calf is shot by a man, and the dog is also killed by the stranger whom the protagonist does not hesitate to shoot in turn. So, in the company of the cow and the female cat, she resumes her usual life with one nagging question, to which she will never find an answer. Why did the stranger kill her animals? So the concept of isolation is the central theme and allows to rethink the old values and principles assumed in the new reality, and to investigate how the existence of the last woman changes over the time. So the world presents a radical and forced experience of degrowth, in which the protagonist is compelled to relinquish all the comforts of modern civilization. And in this new world, society, as we understand it no longer exists. So in her work, Federici discusses the concept of freedom as a form of deconstruction from patriarchy, in which women, especially those who are excluded from the economic cycle, wage labor, can find a path to emancipation through control of their own lives. Although the confinement of Haushofer's protagonist is a tragic and an unchosen condition, it can be interpreted as a metaphor for liberation from social and patriarchal chains, where women have to create new forms of existence in a world that no longer imposes any expectations on them. So the new life is characterized by this feeling of being immersed in a natural cycle that allows her to free herself from the masquerade that all women have been forced to wear. So, in contrast to the linear and hierarchical perspective of the relationship between human and non-human, Haushofer presents an alternative relational model. The protagonist remains aware that the only aspect that will enable her to preserve her distinctiveness in relation to her animals are the ability to care of the others and to assume moral responsibility for decisions. And decades ahead of its time, the novel embodies what Braidotti refers to the Zoe-centered turn. And as she argues, the post-human subject is not isolated but relational, this novel offers a concrete representation of this transformation, showing how real survival does not depend on accumulation but on balance. So this condition of forced renunciation of our software protagonist recalls to the criticism of commercial minimalism, a phenomenon that often presents itself as an alternative to consumerism, but which does nothing but propose new ways of accumulating goods. In the world, minimalism is a necessity imposed by the prevailing circumstances. So the protagonist is powerless in the face of this process. Survival itself depends on the ability to adapt to a world that she taken away all consumer privileges. So, as Meissner points out, the greatest risk is that these practices may become assimilated into the neoliberal paradigm, transforming into individual optimization strategies rather than tools of structural transformation. So in order to avoid this depolitization, it is interesting to link the debate on the growth to the feminist neomaterialism proposed by Braidotti. It is predicated on a rejection of the conception of matter as inert or passive. Instead, it emphasizes matter's agency and active role in the process of transformation. So this vision allows to a deconstruction of the traditional dichotomy between subject and object, demonstrating that consumption is not an isolated act, but a phenomenon that is part of a complex ecosystem of relationships. So in this perspective, minimalism cannot be constructed as a mere individualistic choice, but subtraction. It has to be interpreted as an ethical and political rethinking of materiality. And through the novel, the protagonist is compelled to reevaluate her relationship with the objects, recognizing that replacement or enhancement is no longer a possibility. So everything must be maintained until it reaches complete obsolescence. And in this context, the efficiency of capitalist minimalism, which advocates for the reduction of accumulation without altering the fundamental structures of the economic system, is called into question. So despite the challenges faced, the protagonist exhibits no inclination to return to the preceding states of existence. Now, I would like to propose an innovative parallelism. It is known that the motif of isolation finds its origins in Robinson Crusoe, the archetype of the Western culture, the self-made man who, through work, economic rationality, and domination of nature, manages to survive. Marx identified Robinson Crusoe as the perfect embodiment of the concept of homo economicus, the subject of capitalism that transforms nature into a resource. And in the novel, Crusoe's struggle for survival is accompanied by his transformation of nature into a productive system like the capitalistic one. So he establishes a self-sufficient reality, growing cereals and domesticating animals, and he rationally manages resources. So moreover, he measures time and work in a productive manner, establishing an order based on efficiency. And when he encounters Friday, he reproduces the colonial hierarchies. So these aspects make Crusoe the symbol of an economy based on accumulation and control. And the concept of anti-accumulative minimalism stands in opposition to this mentality. Rather, passively adapting to nature, he recreates the conditions of consumption characteristic of Western societies. Then today, I believe we need new literary archetypes that tell the story of the post-capitalist and post-human world. So the potential for minimalism, degrowth, and ecofeminism to redefine our relationship with the world is evident. Also, first novel has been defined as a Robinsonade because it rewrites the experience of Robinson in a feminist way. Like the female Robinson, she rewrites the reappropriation of the environment from a female perspective. So for both protagonists, there is an unconscious process of metaphorization of the meaning of natural objects and animals, thus making the island and the forest spaces in which to inscribe new meanings. But if on the one hand, the English refers to the traditional allegory of the explorer who perceives the beauty of the territory and conquers it, on the other hand, Haushofer's protagonist overcomes the patriarchal model. At most, she states, I'm calling it my valet, the new owner, if he exists, hasn't contacted me yet. So what a difference. And in contrast to establish his hierarchical predominance, Robinson climbs to the highest point of the island. He shoots a bird using violence as a response to the possible threat from the environment. Moreover, for Haushofer protagonist, work is merely a matter of survival, and tools are not justification for self-aggrandizement, as in Robinson's case. So both these scenarios become radical experiment, a critical reflection on the fragility of the economic system based on continuous growth emerges. So hyper-production, the constant accumulation of goods, shows its true essentially only when it fails. But it is evident that further elements Haushofer's protagonist has in common with Crusoe, like the new conception of time. While Crusoe is characterized by his daily contact with the Holy Scriptures, the female protagonist learns to follow the cycle of natural seasons. So initially, the protagonist of Haushofer is convinced that she can fight the sense of isolation, so she loads the clock, she marks the passing of the days on the calendar, but then for her, the time of the crow begins, in harmony with the cycle of the sun and of the season. So Federici points out that capitalism has made care work invisible, which is essential for our society, but it is not recognized or paid. And while capitalism has imposed an intense work rhythms and dependence on consumption, Degrowth advocates for a deceleration of peace and a re-evaluation of fundamental needs. So on the other hand, the protagonist of The Wolf finds herself compelled to decelerate to align with the rhythms of nature. And Braidotti proposed rethinking of resilience as a relational movement towards the recovery of slow, significant, and interconnected way. So the current era of schizophrenia must give way to an era of care, which is based on mutual aid, public spaces, sharing resources. So the perception of time must also be rethought, and life cannot continue without care or without careful management of resources. But can this really be an alternative to capitalism, or does it become another expression of its ability to adapt? So the greatest risk lies in care washing, whereby the categories of well-being, community, and emotions are used to and reconvert into pre-existing system, which remains intricate to dismantle, of course. The real challenge, therefore, is to understand how to subtract care from the logic of the market and bring it to its original meaning, a human value, collective and shared, that cannot all simply be bought or sold. So taking care of the world means bridging the gap between individualism and communitarism through the concepts of vulnerability and contamination. So it is significant that the novel ends with the end of the death of the animals and the last man who appears unexpectedly. This act symbolizes the destructive progress that has driven humanity toward ecological collapse. It represents a critique of the masculine and patriarchal model that is historically contributed to the ecological crisis of the Anthropocene. And on the one hand, the violent action of the human male confirms male brutality and innocence of his victims, animals and women. On the other hand, it is the expedient through which the author underlines that however suffocating and despicable phallocentric reality is, the solution does not lie in a subversion of forces. The absence of human contact and establishment of female-dominated society is by definition a dysfunctional state. So it is not a coincidence that in the post-humanity model proposed by Haushofer does not coincide with the assertion of a feminist matriarchy. The ethics of care does not have to be considered as a feminist ethic, but as an attitude accessible to all, shareable by all. So the concept and theme of responsibility will be shown to the fundamental or redefining the boundaries of gender and species. And the challenge lies in deconstructing a structured and complex system from its foundations and proposing an economic and social alternative that can guarantee authentic change. So to conclusion, the intent of this contribution was to challenge the dominant economic and social paradigms that sustain capitalism, patriarchy, and consumerism by intertwining the perspectives of degrowth, post-humanism, and ecofeminism. This contribution aims to enrich a dialogue on the transformative potential of cultural products as literature and the necessity of envisioning new viable futures. So the word of the wall describes a kind of minimalism that goes beyond the idea of accumulation, embodying a post-human vision focused on survival, peaceful coexistence with the environment, and strong ecological responsibility. And the juxtaposition of the wall and Braidotti theory invite us to rethink the concept of minimalism, not only as a simple individual lifestyle choice, but as a political and collective act that challenges the dominant logic of unbridled production and consumption. In a context where money and material wealth lose value, every material possession acquires a new symbolic meaning. So in this new scenario, economic capital gives way to symbolic capital based on relationships, sustainability, ethics, and interdependence. So literature in this sense becomes a powerful vehicle for questioning dominant structures and opening up new possibility for existence, pushing society towards a future in which collective well-being and ecologies are priorities. So if minimalism is to truly contribute to the growth, it has to evolve into a collective movement that rejects individual optimization and promotes a new conception of subjectivity. In this scenario, the human being is no longer seen as the center of the world, but as a part of a larger network in which non-human and human life coexist and interact. So the individual is no longer protagonist, but is considered as an actor who acts in harmony with the whole ecosystem. And it is within the symbolic and conceptual framework that also first critique to patriarchal capitalism emerges, proposing an alternative model of value and interaction without reproposing a binary scheme that reposition our matriarchal conception of society at its center. So the wall represents a break with the capitalist and productivist world, highlighting central themes of degrowth and feminist critique of care work. It is a story of resistance and the rediscovery of a more essential and sustainable model of life, and the need to rethink our relationship with nature, time, and work. So, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And now, thank you a lot, Federica, for your presentation. And I think he is very connected also with the presentation of Professor Meissner. And now, I don't know if there are some questions or comments or in general perspectives about these two presentations online or here in presence. And okay, there is one. The first of Lucia. Okay.
Lucia, if you want, you can.
Yeah, you can ask.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. I would like to first thank Federica and Professor Meissner for the presentations. They were really nice and I found them really interesting. Also, Luca and Andre for organizing the conference. I am myself a student of European Studies in Maastricht University, so it's really nice to see Professor Meissner. And I have a question for you. I would like to ask you, in the context of ecological sustainability, how can degrowth be made politically and culturally acceptable given that many societies are deeply committed to the idea of economic growth as a measure of progress, especially above our new generations who are struggling to afford housing and grow families, and they just want to get higher wages. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks so much for the question. It's nice to have someone from Maastricht here. It's a bit, I think, the question that comes after many presentations on degrowth, right? How to sort of make it acceptable, in particular, maybe in societies where the growth has been celebrated for a long time as the key goal and also as the key pathway towards achieving, I think, things that most humans want to achieve, also just to fulfill their needs. And I would say that housing is one such need, right? I'm not sure if it completely, I didn't really have much time to go into that. But part of the degrowth proposal is, of course, to make available something like universal basic services. So that would include something like housing. So the idea very much of growth is one of public luxury and private sufficiency. So the idea that we have a lot of public welfare, including all those things that are related to human needs, housing, education, and all of that. But that there's some certain forms of elite accumulation, in particular the kind that is not about basic needs, the kind that is particularly unsustainable, that these kind of things are being limited. And that is in particular actually concerning a rather, on a global level, a very small percentage of humanity, and within high-income countries, also not everyone, but also rather sort of the higher branches, the richer part, because they are also the ones with the highest ecological footprint. That's what I presented a bit in the beginning, where we see that, for instance, in North America and Europe, so in high-income countries, also the richest 10% have on average an ecological footprint, or a carbon footprint in this case, that is 5 times greater than the rest. So it's mostly about their consumption habits. Now, that being said, all of this does not really come across these days when we talk about degrowth. So I think this sort of degrowth has an image problem that really continues. And one thing that is very frustrating also for, I think, a lot of people who find themselves within the degrowth community is that we constantly have to sort of explain the same thing. Degrowth is not a recession. It's not, about telling the global south what to do. It's not denying them that they can grow. It's not the newest form of austerity politics. And I think in order for this message to come out better, I think it definitely needs media organizations and media power, but I also think that it needs a specific political actor. Now, this is not the mainstream opinion within the degrowth world, but I do think that it might need something like an eco-socialist party that promotes that idea. Yeah, so I think media power, hegemonic power, that which I presented also in part in the presentation, is the key thing. And also we really need to find the political actor behind this. At the moment, the idea is a bit more about horizontalism, multiple communities sort of creating their own version of degrowth and sort of practicing it, and that then taking over, which I think is also good. But I think it needs an addition to that.
Let's hope for the best, and let's hope our politicians can contribute to the cause. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Okay, perfect. Thank you a lot, Lucia, for the question, and Professor Meissner for the clarification and the answer. And now I think there is an answer and a question that Ludovica want to ask, I think, but it's not. No, it's comparsa.
No.
Yeah,
Okay.
I can.
Okay. No, it's here. Okay, perfect.
No, it's just because the professor already kind of answered. It was going to be again on media. I found really interesting the slide on media in Germany. I work a bit in media, and I support the degrowth movement, and I read nothing about it in media. It's really, the articles that you shared are some of the few, and some of them are also quite negative about it. So I was just looking at the slide that you shared and some of the questions that you put on. So how can existing media organizations be co-opted, and how what type of media organization would it need? And I was trying to imagine that in my head, and I really couldn't picture that. I mean, I have a utopia in my head a bit, but I think it's the journalism field is really struggling with funding already, and with funding, journalists are writing about things that are already accepted in mainstream society. So I cannot really envision, unfortunately, a media that is funded by someone to disrupt a society that already exists. So I don't know, do you have any ideas or any suggestions, or how do you envision a society in which journalists are paid by someone to criticize everything that is already existing, and of course change the mentality of citizens? But that's, you need to already, before change the mentality of the editors, change the mentality of people that give funding to big media organizations. So yeah, if you have any inspiring thoughts, that would be really appreciated. Thank you.
Thanks so much. That's a big one for sure. And I think definitely a question that needs to be solved. So I'm afraid I might not have all the answer. I know that there's someone in London working on that, or someone who just applied for a grant on precisely that question. I think what you say is completely correct. Right now, you know, in order for media to survive, sometimes they need to also already cater to a taste that is mainstream, right? So that is the first thing. The second thing that I think you also mentioned is, you know, funding. So media are often also funded, and sometimes they are funded by political interests. Now, those political interests that have the money are usually those who profit from business as usual. So it needs to, you know, how can we fund our own media power if we do not necessarily have the same funds as contemporary capitalist elites? And I think that is really difficult. I think part of why I also think that it needs a political party, and by that I mean something like Eco-Socialist International or something like that, is also to clear those questions of funding in order to make this funding available, and how parties, of course, work is also through membership fees and all of these kind of things. But that's still possibly not enough. So I think it might even need more than that. I think some media models that inspire me these days, that offer some content that is not so mainstream, even though they're not all necessarily pro degrowth, would be something like Novara Media, for instance. And I think they are mostly donation-based. But again, of course, yeah, donation-based is also only going that far. So I think we have not completely solved the question, but I find those, at least these kind of things, inspiring for the time being. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. And I don't know if there are other questions online or here, or intervention in general, comments. Yeah, okay.
No, a very simple question for you both, because in the case of the first speaker, you have spoken of the centrality of education, and you put even education between the most essential condition for well-being. And in the second case, in the second speaker put literature, and that means the cultural work as the potentiality of transforming society through the cultural production. Now, in both cases, the question is that both are very, very expensive, say, product. in order to have a good education, we need a lot of investment from the part of the state, of the community, and so on. And it is the same also in the case of literature. In order to, say, product an artist, say this Marlene Haushofer, we need a lot of investments. So my question is, how can we manage this? Because we are now confronted with the contrary situation. So investments in culture are cut and cut. Well, we know this also at universities, and but not only at school and so on. And the consequence is also say, degrowth also in cultural life, but a very negative degrowth.
Would you like to go first, Federica? Maybe?
No, please.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks very much for the question. So I think there's a lot in that question. And I think it's nice to see also that maybe we both have shared in our presentations an emphasis on education and on culture. I think in answer to your question, I don't think that within the current system, the current economic system that we live in, this is possible. So that is actually for me the reason to suggest a degrowth transformation. I think within a capitalist neoliberal system where the main point is to create a growth that mostly ends up in private hands of a certain capitalist elite, there will never be enough money to fund public services such as education or to fund culture. So I think it only is possible in a political economy that is organized very differently and that operates very strongly with mechanisms of redistribution. And there is, I mean, I hope that I have shown that a bit in my presentation, and of course there's much more to say. There is a lot of capacity for redistribution, so there's a lot of unequal wealth distribution at the moment, and what we need is the right instruments for redistributing. One thing that Jason Hickel, one of the key degrowth advocates, I think, or one of the key voices in that field, always says, as a society, everything that we can produce, we can also finance. So as long as we can produce culture, we can also finance it. It's just a question of how do we make it politically feasible, I would say. There's also one thing that I would briefly like to comment on, which is sometimes there's this sort of use of wording of degrowth in order to describe something like something is shrinking, something is we're getting more poor, let's say poorer in terms of our capacity to provide culture and education. Of course, I understand why the term degrowth might be used for that, but it's definitely not what I mean when I say degrowth. So I think what is being described there is actually rather, I would describe it as austerity. Which is absolutely not the same as degrowth, which, as I said, is about public luxury, private sufficiency.
And I think that the problem is that we are focused on quantity, like Professor Meissner said, and the focus is not on quality. And in order to make this kind of shift, we need to understand how important it is to know the knowledge and the awareness. So the problem is that we can find so many kind of culture products. We can produce so many forms of cultures, and this is not necessarily implies so many expensive projects. Culture has so many forms, also the most simple and the most unexpected ones. The problem is that they can start from a real and a deep knowledge and awareness. We need some systems that can just guarantee this kind of improvement, because it can start from the youngest generation. It comes from the older. It could come from also the academy, in the academy, in the university. It could be have so many forms, different forms. The problem is that we are not so many people are not aware of really aware of the problems, and they are focused on a quantity system because it is the one they know. The one, of course, has its like opportunities and also positive things, because it guarantees some richness, of course, some positive things in our lives. But the problem is that we can show a difference, we can show an alternative, we can show something which can be thought in a different perspective, I believe. I don't know if I explain myself.
I totally agree. And if I can maybe also just add maybe from the sort of more redistributive angle, and I think it's an argument, as you just said, Federica, about quality. And I think it's also, even if it would increase, let's say, quantity and material needs, let's say we want to hire all these new teachers to provide expert education and excellent care for all students. I think if we need also a quantitative increase, I think that is also possible. To give you just one example, I'm now in the Netherlands, where we're also facing cuts in education. It's a new government that is more leaning towards the right, that is, I think, taking a little bit of inspiration also from the US right now, and is slashing education. So basically 1 billion is now being cut that was promised to the educational sector. Now the Netherlands is at the same time a country that gives about 40 billion in subsidies to the fossil fuel industry. Imagine if we would use that instead, at least half of it, or even just a quarter of it, to fund education, and we use the rest maybe to fund healthcare and something else. Right now we're funding an industry that is destroying our livelihoods, destroying the planet, and at the same time creating profit for shareholders of Shell and BP and whatnot. So I think that's a great point to start.
Perfect. Thank you to both of the speakers. And I don't know if there are other questions online or here. I have a very general question about to both of the speakers. That is about more or less something I think connected with these topics, with these arguments, that is how we can change, obviously in a collective sense, but also in our existential context, our idea of happiness, no, in general, because I think it's probably connected with this kind of argumentation. And obviously I want to connect this general idea of happiness also with our, for example, daily life practice to, for example, the use of the social media, no? Because, for example, I think about a very interesting work about this, that is dopamine era, or dopamine nation, I think is in English the translation, of this American psychiatrist, Anna Lemke, that show how exactly for this kind of cultural and economical structure in which we are immersed, we develop some automatic behaviors of how we have to perform some kind of happiness or some kind of well-being. And I think about two elements that you, Professor Meissner, and Federica Guida show. For example, this model of the buen vivir, no? That can be useful in this sense. probably, and if you can say something more about this. And also this connection, this concept of the new conception of time that you said, Federica, with about the vision of Rossi Braidotti, and how we can realize this different perception or immersion in the conception of time that obviously is connected with some kind of project, no, of our future, our connection with the work, etc., etc. And so, yeah, thank you.
Okay, there I go. I believe the problem is that happiness is deeply related to the concept of progress and production and proficiency. So the problem is that we have to like separate this idea, this philosophical idea, to this kind of like new modern myths, and because of course we can feel that efficiency and consumerism and the possibility to spend our money in such a way, in our time in such a way, could be guarantee our happiness and our stability, our well-being in general. But we have to change this kind of vision, of course, starting from ourselves, and then it could be a collective movement, because the intention is fundamental. The problem is that if we sometimes, if we can try to contrast some productivity system, and we try to schedule free time in our busy network, in our busy daily routine, we are just doing the same we just do now. So we just like acting and using that free time, that space, which really had to be connected with happiness and through a deeper state of mind with a neoliberal logic. So the problem is that we have to understand where there is the line, where there's the danger of doing the danger of the care washing, where is the real and the true value and the true model of happiness, and where is the model which they sold us. We are used to see and to intend this kind of value. So the intention maybe can be a first step point to a challenge, to change.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. I think there was already a lot in that response. And so I'm just trying to figure out now where I can maybe connect a little bit. And I'm thinking back a little bit also to my own research on minimalist lifestyles. And I think, so one of the things that I've tried to do when looking at what minimalist self-help, when analyzing all these self-help books and TV shows and online fora, is to sort of figure out, okay, what are the grievances of people who are engaging in that? And often then the grievance is too much stress, too much clutter, too much distraction. But then also what I wanted to look at was, what are the desires that remain unfulfilled then for people, even maybe for people who actually, materially speaking, are already relatively affluent, because otherwise they would probably not engage in minimalism, right? Minimalism is always already about having something that you wish to reduce. And I think some things that came out there was a desire for some better connection to plenty of things, the material world, to your own body, to other people. And I think a philosophical concept that has helped me think about that is Hartmut Rosa, a German sociologist who wrote this book about resonance. And resonance is a concept that he uses in order to try to conceptualize what is maybe the counterpart to alienation. And he describes it as the sort of capacity to have the feeling to be able to impact the world around you as an individual, but also be impacted in return. So it's not about controlling, but rather a sort of porosity in that sense, sort of sense of self-efficacy, a sense of being able to somehow connect to other people, the body, and many other things. So that has helped me a little bit on a conceptual level to understand what's going on there. And I think the other key thing that came out was a sort of desire for inactivity and idleness, and so sort of just some space in that sense, some freedom. I think it's often also coming down to freedom, the freedom from, you know, having to constantly be productive, freedom from constantly having to pay attention to something in the attention economy, something that will maybe generate some platform, some money again. Paying attention to something that can then be turned into advertisement, so that I consume again. So I think those are some sort of key elements in terms of desire that remain unfulfilled under the growth paradigm, even for those people who allegedly profit from it at the moment, or benefit at least from it as sort of consumers. And I think those could be some keys towards envisioning what happiness would be about then in a degrowth scenario.
Sarah Ahmed wrote this book, The Promise of Happiness, which is related to all of these concepts, especially, of course, happiness, but also the model of a good life, and which is the real good, where there is the real good life. So it's very interesting.
Okay, perfect. Thank you a lot, both to these answers. And I don't know if there are other questions or online or here. Or if you want to ask to one another something about the two presentations or some clarifications, I don't know, or something like this.
I was thinking when I heard your presentation that I was very, very interested also in the novel that you presented, and the notion of care, and the fact that it also focused in particular on care, in this case for non-human animals. And I was trying to sort of relate that to the fact that in the introduction, as was said, I think that you're also interested as a researcher in questions of what is maternity all about. So I was wondering whether you think that maybe the narratives that you analyzed also have some clues as to how to envision maybe maternity.
Yes, they are very related to one another. In this novel, the protagonist refuses her human motherhood, because she has two daughters. They are dead, probably because they are out of the world. But she doesn't feel a sort of remorse or just a sort of maternity, what we are used to consider to maternity. Feeling and emotion. So all her practice of her ethic of care and affection are related to the non-human. So it is interesting because there is a refusal of the parameters that are usually attributed to women. So care, affection, like emotions and sensitivity, which are always related to motherhood, but there are related to non-human, which is a sort of proof that the maternity is related. It doesn't be considered a sort of biological state of women, and it is not necessary to be a good person, a good woman, to be to also to feel like complete, because she feel like she feels better in staying in that new world, because she completely changed all the. She wrote this novel in the 1963, so it's very an innovative point of view. Of course, the debates are now in. The problem is that she thought about the theme of the responsibility. I believe it's very interesting because the responsibility for her animals depends on her, which is the human, which is at the top of the hierarchical species and way of concern and consider humanity. But she's also the woman that is not so like a phallocentric model, but she refused the phallocentric model because she's not the common woman and the common mother we can expect. So it's a completely revolutionary way to think and to state freedom from this kind of chains. The responsibility for care and happiness is belongs to everybody, is shareable by all, and it is not related to motherhood.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
It also reminded me a lot of the Donna Haraway, the Staying with the Trouble, yeah, making kin.
Yeah.
Yeah. Love that book, yeah.
Yes, there is another author. She's Guadalupe Nettel. She's from Mexico. For example, she put together the concept and the theme of maternity, different forms of maternity, and the relation with the maternity lived by the animals, like pigeons, like normal pets, not normal pets, but animals that live in our cities and can share the space with us. And so the two different forms and meanings of being mother and taking care. And I believe it's really like we have to do debates and discussions about these kind of themes, because we need to deconstruct some chains and some ways that are like dominated once.
Absolutely, yes. I would love to have more conversations about that.
Okay, perfect. I don't know if there are other interventions. You want to say something? No? Federica? No. Okay.
No, I was thinking about that media sometimes can have a positive way of produce and share concepts that can be like used by a wider audience. So sometimes we always think about like a common communication, misinformation, disinformation spread by media, but sometimes there are positive ways. Like I'm thinking about some videos, groups, and the use of social networks by the youngest generations, and how they can vehiculate some positive model through them. So what do you think about it?
I think so too, yes. I mean, I would also, so before there was a question about sort of media that cater to the mainstream, and I think that is true, sort of if we look at it in a sort of from the perspective of math, and what is mainstream. But it is also true, and it's also, I think, worthwhile acknowledging that there are, of course, increasingly also some alternative media that are trying to spread alternative ideas. So, for instance, one podcast that has inspired me a lot and keeps inspiring me is the podcast Upstream. So they have a lot of conversations on degrowth, amongst many other things, and I think they're doing great work in that sense. And I think that's a bit of a hopeful thing to look towards. Yeah.
Yeah, it's very nice, this podcast. I also know this. Yeah. No, I wanted to ask you something connected. Yeah, now after I leave the word to Lucia, not only because it's connected with this, but how we can create or share or transform these contexts that obviously are a very big potential of the social media, this platform in general, also to just share or basically create some different languages or a representation of this crisis, or also because you say now that degrowth, post-growth is also a political project now in some sense. But obviously the contradiction or the problem or the conflict is that a lot of time, obviously, these platforms or these social media are managed by super strong billionaires like Elon Musk, for example, to say one, or others. And so obviously that is full of very strong economic and political interest. And so how is possible to stay in this context, but at the same time to create some kind of rebellion inside this context, and obviously to create some some forms, obviously in the cultural and artistic sense, for example, or the civil disobedience. I think this is the word. And and then I leave the word to Lucia.
Shall I go first, maybe, or yeah? I think, in a way, you have already mentioned I think you have already mentioned a lot that I would also mention in my response, in the sense of, I think on the one hand, when it comes to sort of media, there's this sort of strategy of co-opting and trying to leak degrowth ideas into the mainstream and into political, or into media infrastructures, let's say, or media platforms that might actually be managed and owned by political interests that are, to put it mildly, opposed to degrowth, such as X and what have you. So I think that is one strategy, and the other strategy would be, of course, to try to at the same time build alternatives. And I think the second part is maybe a little bit less developed than the first. So, I mean, it happens every day, right, that countercultural messages are spread via mainstream platforms that are owned by Elon Musk. But of course, it also only gets so far within the existing algorithms, and after we stay within our own filter bubbles and all these kind of things. Which is why I think the building of alternative media power is also probably very important. But I also feel that I don't really yet have the final answer. When it comes to civil disobedience, I think for me, civil disobedience, it's a beautiful tactic. It can be in some contexts. What I think like to see more is to sort of have the sort of theory of change and the strategy around it. So I've myself engaged quite a lot within the environmental justice movement, Extinction Rebellion, Scientist Rebellion, whatnot. And what happened there sometimes is that civil disobedience became the strategy in and of itself of change. And I think that's maybe granting it a little bit too much importance. So I think it can be a useful tactic in some political contexts, but it needs to be embedded in a wider political strategy and theory of change. So I think that is something that as social movements probably, and within environmental justice, we need to think more about what is the sort of overarching theory of change and the overarching strategy that civil disobedience might fall into then.
Thank you.
Yes, I think that especially for the social media, the risk is that if we use them like tools of information, it's a little bit problematic. But if we use them to share ideas, groups, and to like enrich our information, that could make the difference. So I believe that this is like a sort of line of problematic situation, because they are always situated in a particular context, in historical one, sociological, and also technological one. So the problem is if it is like our source of information, or like a sort of way to improve and to understand other forms of information.
Thank you. And Lucia, I don't know if you have another question.
I wanted to mention, going back to what you were saying before about maternity and ecologism. It reminded me of a book I read a few months ago by Sandra Steingraber, and it's called Ecologia's Journey to Motherhood, and made me think of how also pollution affects the bond between the baby and the mothers, and how also affects the quality of the milk of the first breastfeeding. And yeah, I find it really interesting, the interconnection between both ecologism and motherhood.